So, welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to another battle replay, and it seems like we've been going through these rather classic iconic maps one after the other lately because we are going to be making a return to Helm's Deep today. Helm's Deep, of course, did have a fairly substantial update somewhat recently in the sense that we now have an interior, albeit I'm not entirely sure whether this version of the map is the one that was actually used for this battle replay in a rather peculiar way, for reasons that will become immediately apparent soon. If this does prove to be the case, however, I can acquire the older version of the map once again from the player who sent me this replay, and when the battle actually begins you will notice the map change back to the previous version, aside from the one that has these extra features in it, which would be a bit of a shame. I do hope that this is the version of the map that they were actually playing on, but there's no guarantee of that, and just because of some of the peculiarities with how this battle replay seems to have started, I have my doubts whether this is the one that was actually utilised for reasons that will become apparent very, very soon. But aside from that, I mean, Helm's Deep, as it is, if you take away the interior part of the settlement, is a very simple fortress, kind of difficult to take, but we often see the attackers win because the defenders... The middle section is often where Helm's Deep starts to become unstuck a little bit, and even if this is the incorrect version of the map, which I believe it is, we will still be able to go through the army compositions because they won't have changed, and of course Helm's Deep itself is still very much the kind of thing that it always is. Irregardless, we will go through the attacking armies first and foremost, starting way back over here with the forces of Isengard, played by Hickscrew. Isengard, of course, very much a mainstay when it comes to attacking Helm's Deep for obvious thematic reasons, albeit Rohan themselves are not actually on the defence today. It's a combination of Mirkwood and Numenor instead. But Isengard themselves will still be a very useful attacking force. Their mid-tier units going into their, well, their heavier mid-tier units, I should say, are very, very useful when it comes to storming a fortress. We can see the Uruk-hai infantry are here, one of the mainstays of that because of their defensive abilities. They're also perfectly capable of dishing out damage for a line infantry unit of this calibre as well, which makes them really, really useful all round for assaulting a fort like this. Dunlending veterans are obviously of a lower tier. They're still capable of chucking out damage relative to their class of unit because of their choice of weaponry in a one-handed axe and shield, but of course they have substantially less staying power than the heavier and more skillful, actually, Uruk-hai infantry. But still, the Dunlending veterans are very cheap, and they do offer you a good amount of numbers on the front line. And for this sort of situation, alongside the heavy Uruk-hai, you could certainly make the argument that they're a little bit better than the Uruk-hai raiders for the extra damage that they may end up dealing, although that's a question of against a faction with the defensive faculties of Mirkwood and Numenor. Dunlending clansmen are here as well in force. They are a very, very entry-level unit, of course. They're not quite fodder in the same way that the Orc fodder or Snaga stalkers are. They do have a little bit more going on for them than that, especially with regards to an anti-cavalry bonus. It makes sallying out against them in a siege where they're on the attack a little bit less appealing, shall we say. Isengard in general has got plenty of options for anti-cavalry, which is understandable given their natural enmity with Rohan, but Dunlending clansmen here in high numbers, mainly in a siege like this, they're going to be used as fodder even still. More Uruk-hai infantry in and amongst things. Over here we have floating two-handed swords from the Nazkai, because in a rather strange turn of events they're pushing the siege tower. But yes, Nazkai obviously one of the scariest unit of armor-piercing bodyguard infantry in the game. Very, very dangerous, especially against the likes of Numenor. They will be hoping that the Nazkai do not target them specifically, but we shall have to wait and see on that front. There's some half-orc spear guard in here, which do make for a decent little mid-tier defensive unit, which otherwise Isengard would lack. They don't really have anything in regards to spears. A lot of their pole arms are a little bit more immobile than that, shall we say, and the Uruk-hai pikemen, the spear guard, offer them something with a little bit more mobility. They've got decent defensive values as well, but naturally in comparison to their Uruk-hai companions, they are not exactly the best when it comes to dealing damage. Guards of Orthanc are a very defensive unit of spears, obviously equipped with the finest armour that Isengard can muster. Dunlenders that have been outfitted with it as well, as Saruman's personal guard. They're going to be here holding things down in the attack for Helm's Deep. More Dunlenders are here as well, and there's some more spear guard, and unsurprisingly another kind of unit that we're going to be seeing. Fire of Orthanc is here, so we do have the black powder cart, as it were, thematic for Helm's Deep once again. It's kind of interesting. I mean, it's more of a gimmick than anything for Isengard. It's kind of, for Helm's Deep it's very useful because the defensive areas that you can occupy as the defenders are quite constricted. So the Black Powder Cart can actually end up doing a lot of damage. For more substantial siege maps in terms of size, however, the Black Powder Cart can be mitigated in its effectiveness by the defenders if they're paying attention. But in this case, it'll be a little bit more difficult to do that. There are, of course, Uruk-hai pikemen mixed in here. You'd be mad to really bring an Isengard army without Uruk-hai pikemen. It's one of the genuine strengths they have, and especially in a siege like this, they should be very useful. We've got a catapult and Uruk-hai crossbows as well, so plenty of options for Isengard to use from a range perspective as well. I mean, Helm's Deep's wall is going to struggle to maintain its rigidity with Black Powder Cart and artillery such as this. My computer fan is going crazy, and there is a reason for that, as we will see when we move on to the defenders. Second attacking army is Sprozkoana Gazawana Woda. I hope that I've pronounced that correctly, but playing as Mordor, who got plenty of trolls, some troll drummers, which still in this version of the game obviously don't function. We're waiting for the next patch before they actually become useful in terms of buffing the morale of nearby units once again. Olag-hai are significantly more useful as a bludgeon. We have another catapult, more trolls as well, the troll catapult, so once again Helm's Deep's wall is going to really struggle, but this is a very elite focused Mordor army. You can see this right from the off, which I've made my misgivings about in the past somewhat clear, but I mean, it's not pointless to bring a Mordor army like this, but you're really doing your team a bit of a disservice when you go for Mordor's quality in comparison to their numbers ability, when you consider that Isengard are more of a balanced team, and the final attacking army on this occasion is going to be Umbar, who are almost forced in many ways, if they want to be super effective, to go for that high quality option. So in the end, you're cutting down on your manpower as the attackers pretty substantially if you go for this approach as Mordor, and you're never going to out-quality a defensive force of Numenor and Mirkwood in this situation. Minas Morgul Chosen and Sauron's Will are here, so heavy spears and heavy axemen again of the upper tier variety. There are a few more basic units in Moran Infantry and Orc Maulers set up around here, not in great numbers. Moran on Guard here as well. More Minas Morgul Chosen and Moran on Guard. Is a bizarre choice to see the Beasts of Gorgoroth, even if they can be used to batter their way through defensive lines, especially in the lower section of the fortress. I find it somewhat difficult to believe that they're going to not die very, very quickly when they get in there. And also, once again, we've already mentioned the constrictive nature of Helm's Deep as a map, even with the additional area behind the fortress itself now included. The Beasts of Gorgoroth are going to struggle to move around, so even if they were able to keep moving and mitigate their own weaknesses under normal circumstances, they're going to find that very difficult in a map such as this. And finally, the Nazgul here at the back. They're going to be there. If they can integrate themselves with some of these other units, they should be okay. Now we move on to the first rather bizarre setup for an army, which is part of the reason why I somewhat believe this is one of the wrong maps. We have the Umbar army, which is, for a start, pointing the wrong way, but also split in a rather peculiar fashion. Tintin is playing as Umbar, good to see him again. Harbingers of Castamere, plenty of Alcarondas Legion in here as well. Umbar, of course, always quite capable of going for the higher quality path. We also have some Balakith Axguard. Again, that armour piercing when you consider that Numenor are on the defence. They're, their ancestors really in many ways, Numenor. The armour piercing is the sort of thing which they know will be useful against them, so it's not too surprising to see Balakith Axguard brought, a couple of units of them. Of course, they have Blackguards for Javelins. Javelins in a siege situation like this are always going to be useful, provided they can get to good positions. Helm's Deep's fort is kind of difficult to position units such as this effectively, but we shall see. We've got some Ardenheim Shield Guard, a couple of units of them, again very high tier spears, not the most damaging, but very, very difficult to wear down. And Shield Bearers as well, which are a line infantry unit that are armour piercing. They don't have the damage of the Balakith Axguard, they don't have the all-around stats of the Alcarondas Legion, but as long as you know you're going up against an armoured force, they can still be very useful, and they've got a good shield value as well. Now then, there are also a couple of other units over here. We've got some Corsair Infantry, more Blackguards, and another unit of Corsair Infantry all pointing the wrong way. Now this is where we will see my suspicions kind of realised somewhat. To be fair, Helm's Deep does have this problem where the defenders have to deal with some peculiarities when it comes to the initial setup, but never have I seen this before. Johanna's playing as Numenor, and Winged Swordsman 44, who sent me this battle replay, playing as Mirkwood. All of their units are clustered over here, so it's going to be very, very difficult to pick things out, but you kind of know what to expect. You know, they're outnumbered, so the individual army is going to be of high quality. Numenor are going to bring plenty of cohorts and shield guard as their main line. We can see the Royal Legion of Armenlos are in there. The Pharazim Swordmasters are there too. And also in terms of support, I would imagine that we're going to be seeing pikes. And as far as archers go, Mirkwood probably taking the lion's share of them. There's Greenwood Rangers, unsurprisingly. some Royal Guard from Mordor, Numenor, Wooden Realm Patrol, perhaps some Wardens of Ammon Lank in there as well. But yeah, Mirkwood are going to have some high tier units as well. We can see the Ents are also on the defence, Seafarers of Nindamos as well. Something else which is very, very peculiar is, I'm sure that you've already somewhat noticed this, or at least the eagle-eyed among you will have. There are 2 trebuchets out here which are Numenor's trebuchet, which is very, very bizarre. It shouldn't be out here. The crew is probably over there, but irregardless of this, I think it's probably due to the fact that the updated version of Helm's Deep wasn't the version of the map that they were actually playing on. But as far as actually looking at what the armies were, I will ask the player who sent me the battle replay if this is accurate. The composition phase is fine, however I'm just going to be recording the intro today after all in conjunction with a channel update that I'm going to be doing. So the actual recording of the battle phase can wait until effectively next weekend for me. So it shouldn't be too much of a problem. We've seen the army compositions here. If you see the map suddenly reverts to the old version of Helm's Deep, then you know exactly what happened. But if it stays the same, then this rather strange setup is actually how the battle started, which is strange, but there it is. I'll make a cut and we'll rejoin when the battle begins.
The enemy are through the wall. Fight on! We must get no further.
So I guess with the charge going off, we will actually rejoin here, considering a lot of these archers are actually firing upon the enemy now. A few things to note, of course, is that we are now on the old version of the map, because that was indeed the problem as I suspected. Of course, all the compositions remain very much the same, only this time the trebuchet is actually inside the walls for the defenders this time, so that can only be a good thing. And kind of as expected, I suppose, the attackers are going to be using their very heavy artillery presence, and of course using their black powder cart in this case to bombard the walls a little bit and make it far more difficult to hold this lower section of the fortress. Now this could end up being a little bit of a blessing in disguise perhaps for the defenders, because that may convince them to fall back to the inner keep a little bit faster, and that is of course a better place to hold your ground if you are under a little bit of pressure. I hope that that's not the case though, because that will make this quite a difficult battle to commentate on, whereas an all-out brawl for the lower section of the fortress will be far more entertaining to watch from our perspective. Meanwhile, Theo Winged Swordsman continues to utilise his ammunition fairly liberally, to be honest, with plenty of these elven archers opening up. I mean, there isn't a ton of dead orcs on the field here, considering the amount of damage they've already done. One of the siege towers has fallen apart as a result of the trebuchet trying to crumble it and succeeding at that. But I don't think the siege tower is going to be all that relevant, to be honest with you. We may see 1 or 2 get up onto the walls so that the attackers can contest the slightly higher ground in the lower section of the fortress and maybe have a direct route to the outer ring of the main keep. But other than that, I don't think they're going to be too significant, especially when you consider that there's still so many of them. You're not really going to be able to stop them from utilising their siege towers. Meanwhile, are they going after the trebuchet? It does look as though they are trying to do a bit of counter-sniping. And now what's... I mean, they're using the standard shot on the trebuchet, which will make it, of course, deadly accurate, as these Corsair Blackguards are finding out. But it's not going to be as devastating either. The trebuchet's best damage comes with the flaming shot because of the additional splash damage that it can do. I mean, of course, their blackguards are dangerous, but once again, unless you can wipe out the whole unit, you're still going to have to face down the javelins that they're going to be trying to utilise on your infantry line. So I'm not sure. Now we can see the flaming shot here, and any direct hits from them will be significantly more effective. Troll Catapult continues to do its thing. Pieces of Gorgoroth are there also. And it looks like we are going to start to see a little bit more of a general advance now. You can see that the Nazgul are moving forward, and they have been seen almost immediately. They're getting knocked over, so that means that the Elders of the Elven King are going to be shooting at them. Standard archers as well, by the looks of things. So the Nazgul very much noticed, trying to get in and amongst the Orc Maulers, who will block the shots with their bodies, but they will also end up dying really very, very quickly. Trebuchet starting to miss a few more of its shots now with the flaming shot, but not all of them. And you can see how much more effective that was, even with the Corsair Blackguards in a thinner formation now. I can only apologise, hoping my voice can actually hold out for the rest of this recording. Meanwhile, they do need to get their archers off that wall, to be honest, because it's getting crumbled, and another few shots and they will fall away. You can actually see that the Numenorians setting up a more traditional front line, really, rather than fighting on the walls in that sense. They are instead going to try and hold their lines like this. Now, under normal circumstances, I wouldn't really recommend spearmen against Olag High, but in the Numenorians' case, because their spears do have that AP, the Olag High will be under a little bit more pressure. But even so, when you consider that the Balagaya pikemen are being pushed onto the front lines as well, not going to go quite so well for them. But the Olag High are going to need reinforcements fairly quickly here, otherwise they are going to get burnt down by the sheer damage that the regular Numenorian infantry is capable of doing. I mean, it does look as though Mordor are going to try and do that. There's a huge amount of Mordor units pushing forward. Trebuchet is right there. I mean, the Trebuchet would actually be better off shooting at the Mordor assault now. Another one of these walls getting crumbled. The elves moving a little bit to the side. Woodland protectors were using their javelins against the Mordor forces that are now pouring into the settlement. A little bit, perhaps, of a disjointed assault. I mean, Isengard are moving forward now, so if they can get forward quickly enough, then this is going to be pretty difficult, honestly, for Numenor to try and hold on to. They do have a Numenorian cohort that can move in and make very quick work of most of the Isengard forces that are coming forward. But there's a large amount of Mordor units coming forward here, and included in there, you can see some Sauron's Will, Minas Morgul chosen, so a good balance here of armour-piercing damage, which is going to be very necessary for doing any sort of significant damage to the Numenorian front line, but also some survivability, mitigating a little bit of the damage Numenor can chuck out in melee and at range. And yeah, you can see how quickly actually the Olag High have started to fall away. I mean, they have done a little bit of damage to the Balagaya pikemen, but ultimately the Numenorian infantry earning its pay here. Troll drummers are also in here as well. Like I said, troll drummers actually don't act as a morale battery in this version of Reforged, and they won't until the next patch comes out. So really using them as standard trolls is the best you can do, but they're not very good at that in comparison to the alternatives. Of course, their blackguards, meanwhile, are doing a lot of damage to this unit of Numenorian cohort, and Numenor probably do need to start thinking about hiding this unit, because this is the kind of damage that the defenders can scant afford to take. The Trebuchet has repositioned itself, and it is kind of rare. I mean, if they're throwing rotten meat already, that's probably a bad sign, but considering the lower tier nature of the Isengard forces, you may get a bit of a chain rout. And it is actually a very neat and organised front line, this. So the Numenorians getting themselves into a good position. Numenorian cohort says defeat seems certain, but I think that will flick around pretty quickly as the Dunlending clansmen get absolutely butchered. I mean, the veterans will do slightly better, but not that much more. They don't have the armour piercing on those axes that would be required to make them a truly effective fighting force against the Numenorian cohort. I mean, when you look at this though, the Numenorian front line, in spite of how well it's held up to the initial Numenorian assault with the trolls and the like, starting to look a little bit thin on the ground now. Beasts of Gorgoroth moving forward, unless they can continue moving. It's pretty cool to see them loom in through the walls, but if they can't keep moving, they're going to die very quickly, as you can see here. They don't have the same survivability as Mumakil. The Mumakil themselves can be very fragile when they get stopped. Numenorian cohort and Hiri Alth have got the damage necessary to do the business. They also don't really have the same level of splash damage by the looks of things that the Mumakil do in melee. They are actually doing a lot of damage to that Numenorian cohort though, so their melee attacks are still very dangerous, but they are dying off pretty quickly now. Certainly not worthwhile in the grand scheme, but still pretty cool nonetheless. The defenders will be pretty happy with the fact that the beasts have fallen. And just as I was about to head over there, the main gate has also fallen. Having a look, the elves are ready with some Numenorian pike support. Something else that's worth mentioning as well is I think Numenor and Mirkwood offset one another very, very nicely. They're both very quality-heavy factions, but they're focused on very different things. Numenor, of course, on their armour, a little bit more aggression, a little bit more upfront punch, and obviously then they've got their archers as well, which are a little bit more focused around doing damage, but they don't have as much ammunition. Mirkwood, on the other hand, of course, more about that elven skill, far more focused on their archers in comparison. And I just think they make a very good pair. Numenorian cohort getting slightly surrounded now, some reinforcements on the way, but these Dunlending veterans actually making some good progress before they will be put under a little bit more scrutiny by more Numenorians. Numenor also being given the business by some Snaga skirmishers, and these javelins will have the desired effect. They may be cheap, but they will not be the sort of thing that the armoured Numenorian infantry will particularly enjoy facing off against, but more by accident than by design. I think the Numenorian cohort are actually going to engage with them in melee, and that will probably be enough to rout them off fairly quickly, if I had to guess. Some half-orc spearguard moving forward to keep the Isengard pressure up. I mean, they do need to, because otherwise these Numenorian cohort will be free to move in and assist the main line. I mean, I have to say, Gazawana Woda has been extremely aggressive with his Mordor army. Temple Executioners are in here now, and it is having an effect, I should say, on the Numenor front line. There's only so much of this sort of punishment Numenor are going to be able to take, which is probably why we're seeing some elements of the Elven infantry force down here as well to try and keep this defence up. But they're going to need to be a little bit more, they're going to need to commit a bit more, I think. I mean, Woodland Round Patrol that are out of ammunition may do fine, considering that the Pharazim Swordmasters are also getting involved. That will surely be the end of the Olag High, who were temporarily pulled off the front line, going toe-to-toe with the Temple Executioners. But the Temple Executioners have got a lot more in the way of support around here now, and if Isengard are paying attention, they could even use their Snaga Skirmishers to help burn through that 3 HP that the Pharazim Swordmasters have. Numenorian cohort mopping up what remains of the Dunlanding veterans, who have actually performed. They've been far more resilient than I would have expected them to be, actually. They haven't done as much damage, perhaps. I think most of the damage here is as a result of overwhelming numbers and the javelins. Half-Orc Spearguard will take a little while for the Numenorians to carve their way through, and in that time, Isengard can utilise their javelins to good effect. Looks like these Snaga Skirmishers are out of ammunition, so they're just going to be thrown in to the meat grinder as cannon fodder against the upper echelon of the Numenorian infantry force. More Snaga Skirmishers coming in, so plenty of these Snaga javelins. Under normal circumstances, you might expect Isengard to invest more heavily in their crossbows than their cheap jabbies, but here they are nonetheless. And that is fairly cost effective, to be fair. It's certainly proven to be a good addition so far, with a lot of these javelins having a good impact against the Numenorian infantry that's been contesting the lower fortress. But the Mordor general does fall, and you can immediately see some routing as a result of that. More of the basic Mordor orcs are now fleeing. Obviously those Nazgul taking some pretty hefty damage on the approach. There's Mordor Chosen also routing as a result of overextending themselves into the Woodland Protectors. And it's looking like Mordor's assault may actually fall apart with the loss of their general there. Probably one of the most impactful general losses we've seen, because they did have the numbers to maybe not push all the way up to the top of the hill over here, which the Seafarers of Nindamos really starting to twist the knife a little bit here with their javelins. And Mordor may be pushed out of the fortress altogether, which is bad news for the attackers. They really need to keep these assaults going. I mean, Isengard should still be fine over here. There still isn't a huge Numenor presence to completely turn the tide over here, but still, Uruk-hai Crossmen claiming the high ground. And this is the sort of thing which may convince the Numenorians to pull back now. I mean, the javelins have been one thing, but having to contend with crossbows in an advantageous position with regards to your infantry as well is not going to end too well for them. And the Half-Orc Spearguard doing the business as well in terms of staying alive a little bit longer than the equivalent units. Minas Morgul Chosen fighting alongside the Temple Executioners and doing a good job. I mean, together they may be able to overwhelm the Pharazim Swordmasters. There's only 30 of them left alive now. So even with that mass rout, Numenor may still be able to claim this territory, but it'll come at a far greater cost than it otherwise would have done. Nazgul may have lost the general, but they themselves are still alive, getting into the Seafarers of Nindamos and preventing them now from using their javelins. Seafarers can defend themselves fine in melee, but against Nazgul, maybe not. Naran Royal Guard up here on the walls. So far, we've yet to really see Umbar commit themselves too much. There's plenty of dead Corsair infantry who pushed up the ram and got through the gates, of course, but I mean, Umbar do have the necessary qualities to go toe-to-toe, especially with Numenor, with the little bit of armour-piercing Umbar can sprinkle into their roster, but yeah, it does look as though maybe now they're going to make a play on the game. Alcarondas Legion leading the way, a very accomplished infantry unit, as we've said many times in the past. I don't know whether they're going to be enough here. Corsair infantry trying to shoot over the walls, not necessarily the best of shots, but doing some extra damage to the Seafarers there. Meanwhile, Corsair infantry moving forwards, maybe out of ammunition, but only one unit of them isn't going to be enough to really make too much of an impact against the Elven defenders that stand resolutely in their way. Elven protectors just in behind, Moran on guard, who are already wavering. They will return to the fight, I'm sure. Uruk-hai infantry now moving forward, and yeah, the final remnants really of the Numenorian defence over here is going to be overcome by Isengard. Yeah, Uruk-hai infantry individually, one-on-one, they're not going to be able to defeat Numenorian cohort, but it was pretty far away from one-on-one by the time they arrived on the scene. And Isengard will now be able to push forward, and that should be enough to meet up with what very little remains of Mordor, and push Numenor all the way back into the main keep, and the lower section of the fortress will be conquered. And round patrol victory still seems certain for them, of course, against this solitary unit of Corsair infantry that's thrown themselves into the fire. We can protect us over here with seafarers who have already taken a lot of damage. I mean, a few more of the Nazgul have fallen, but with that somewhat inefficient support from the Corsair infantry, though, they have managed to do a ton of damage to that unit of seafarers. Uruk-hai crossbowmen getting involved as well. Uruk-hai infantry advancing forward. So I mean, they are taking the lower fortress piece by piece. It was a very aggressive and violent initial battle, of course, instigated by Mordor. Mordor ended up paying the lion's share of the price for the territory that the attackers now hold. You are. Let's have a little look at what's going on over here. So yes, Umbar are moving in fairly aggressively as well. We can see Alcarondas Legion there, Ardenayam Shield Guard, which I was a little bit... I mean, I wasn't sure about that addition, because unlike the Numenorian heavy spears, they don't have the armour piercing. They're very good defensively, but Umbar, I felt, may need a little bit more in terms of their ability to deal damage if they're going to go toe-to-toe with the elves. But if you're going to use the spears, this is a really good situation to use them in. An aggressive push where, in order to keep the attack going, you need a more defensively savvy unit. Over here, these elven front lines made up primarily of spears on the front and the heavy swordsmen just in behind. I mean, it's a very effective front line, this, from the Mirkwood elves. Umbar, under normal circumstances, will fancy their chances in an infantry fight, but the waters are somewhat muddied against Mirkwood. Umbar have got certain advantages when it comes to their survivability, heavier armour, maybe a few more options when it comes to armour piercing, but Mirkwood have got that extra skill. I don't think the lower armour values of Mirkwood actually are going to come into play unless Umbar can get into a position with their ranged support, and I'm not convinced they're going to be able to do that too easily given the lay of the land. Looking like, look at that, the mass death of the Numenor Royal Guard there coming out as a result of the Troll Catapult. That is something of a bug, I suppose, on the outer wall of Helm's Deep, which has simply never been attended to. Hitting the wall, you can actually crumble the outer walls of Helm's Deep, but if you hit it, it's still going to be enough to do absolutely devastating damage to the archers that are on it, and obviously Numenor Royal Guard are not cheap archers by any means. They're intended to be used in melee as the battle wears on, so important losses sustained here by the defenders, but the Greenwood Rangers can certainly repay that in kind for the Umbar infantry force which is moving in. The feat seems certain. I'm not surprised when they're under range of fire like that. Meanwhile, the very final remnants of the outer defence now, with the Woodland Protectors being dealt with by Moran Guard and Nazgul, but just stacking up here the orcish elements of the attacking armies, getting ready to attack in. It's going to be incumbent upon Isengard really to be the ones to make this work now. I mean, rotting meat for the attackers isn't really going to be all that worthwhile. You're far more likely to inflict routing and morale shocks upon your own men than you are on Numenor and Mirkwood in a dug-in position, unfortunately for you. Plenty of reinforcements still to be committed as Umbar continue to throw themselves against the elven lines. Another unit of Hiriouth being committed. This, I mean, utilising the Rangers now, I mean, when and how you use your Rangers can often be such an important factor in the current version of the game, considering how powerful these body-piercing projectiles can be. This is a good opportunity to use it, I think. I mean, Umbar Their units are of good quality. Alcarondas Legion and Ardnine Shield Guard ripping through them with Rangers is going to be a pretty good idea, I believe. And this of course will also mean you're going to have more infantry as time wears on, as you're going to lose less if you can kill them more quickly. Our Royal Guard's still waiting, and also the reinforcements are a bit too far away for my liking. From Umbar, they're too far. I mean, you put yourself at risk of getting hit by archers, I suppose, but at this point the defender's attention is most certainly going to be inward facing in the fortress rather than outward. So I think you need to take the risk of getting your reinforcements closer, because as it stands this whole attack could fall apart and you're going to have nothing really to respond in kind to that with. The attack begins over here, the Snaga unsurprisingly routing very, very quickly in the face of this defensive line. Most of it actually is around this unit of Naru Naru Sentinel Pikes is out of ammunition Elven Archers forming up the meat of this front line. Even still, this is going to be a difficult choke point for Isengard to push their way through, and indeed they start to fall apart very, very quickly. More is going to be required, and this is what I'm kind of worried about here for the on behalf of the attackers. I'm not sure whether they're going to be able to keep these attacks going, and I think they're going to be bled out at the wrists here. If they continue to approach the battle in this way, I think the defenders are going to have too much for them in terms of quality and damage dealing for these small attacks they're sending forward. There are a couple of ways in which they can approach this. They can either go all in, which based on the length of the fight we still have left to go I think is somewhat unlikely, or they can try and take a more conservative approach and try and wear the enemy down in terms of resources first and foremost. I don't know whether they're going to be successful in that. I mean, these Troll Catapult coming in now, but far too late to reinforce the Umbar line, and even so, I mean, the Elves are going to be very well positioned to kill these Trolls off pretty quickly ultimately. Unfortunately for Mordor, I mean, I appreciate the fact that Mordor has been an extremely aggressive combatant. It makes for more interesting fights, but it hasn't really worked out in the way that he would have been hoping for, I'm sure. And the Elves are going to be all too happy to accept more kills. Some isolated members. I mean, I guess the good thing for Umbar is a lot of their units do tend to be lock morale at the higher level, Ardnine Shield Guard included, so they will have to be killed to the last man, but that's going to be cold comfort for them as they join the rest of the corpses on the floor just into the Gatehouse. Further back, Horns of Ammon Lank in position now as well. Temple Executioners making up the only combatants on the front line now. I mean, they'll be able to kill a fair few Hiri Peng, but as soon as they encounter the Naru Naru Sentinels, they'll be kept at arm's length and ultimately disposed of as the battle goes along. This is the part of the battle where ultimately the newer version of the map is more interesting to watch, because you have a pathway that goes around there and also the route into the caves directly. Makes it a more entertaining spectacle, which is why I hope that that version of the map is the one that's made default whenever the next patch comes out. Perhaps if ever the next patch comes out is the better verbiage to use there. But I do believe that it can only be good for Helm's Deep. Meanwhile, outright victory here as the Umbar assault finally falls apart completely with the death of those Troll Catapult crewmen. And yeah, full collapse of an attack like that is never really a good thing. I mean, javelins are attempting to be used, and maybe this is the way forward for the attacks at this point. Maybe they feel as though they actually don't have the resources to compete at this stage with their foe. Killing off a few of the Wardens of Ammon Lank, but this is a very slow method of trying to even the odds a little bit. They are getting some hits, but not much in the way of kills. The unit of Hiri out on their way over, probably going to be trying to overwhelm the Nazgul and Temple Executioners that remain and get at the squishy Snaga skirmishers that wait in behind. They are in a weird situation now though, the attackers. Now that they've had so many of their attacks be either extremely costly or go awry, what do they do? And a lot of their units are very scattered as well, so it points towards them being maybe a little bit disorganised, maybe the interplay between the players not quite on point at this stage. I mean, as the attackers with an army advantage, of course, they do have a greater margin for error than the defenders do, and Numenor themselves took fairly hefty losses in the lower fortress, so all is not lost for the attackers. As much as things have looked a little bit messy, things can still work out just fine for them. Mirkwood, their unit sort of vibrating in place. I do wonder why the Elven swordsmen often do this. But there you go. The Elven line still very much intact after the ill-fated Umbar attack. The loss of those Nara and Reorganized may be the most significant thing that's happened on the front gatehouse. And so far, I think we are going to have one player admits defeat, which I would assume is Mordor. So, not the greatest loss in the grand scheme, because they didn't really have anything left anyway. So it's going to be up to Isengard and Umbar to try and pick up the slack now. We're going up to ×2 speed purely because I don't know when the next large-scale assault is coming. I mean, Umbar is starting to mobilise by the looks of things, but Snaga skirmishers are retreating. And obviously there's not much to really commentate on if the attackers are simply trying to reassess the situation and then move in again. The other thing to consider is still Winged Swordsman is being a little bit more liberal with his ammunition. I don't know how much the Greenwood Rangers necessarily have left. Meanwhile, of course, they have Blackguard, so over here, Umbar as well as Isengard trying to use their javelins, play that game of cat and mouse, but I think the defenders can actually feel fairly confident in their ability to do this at this point, and that's to just directly chase the javelins off. Force a confrontation by being aggressive, utilising a unit of Hiri Lang to do that with. They actually do manage to get in there. The charge not really going as well as it would. I mean, the front ranks were the only ones that continued that charge. A little bit strange, but it is what it is. Some of Medieval 2's eccentricities are really impossible to sandblast off the game at this point. Rapidly heading towards 20 years of Medieval 2. And 2026 that will be the situation. Meanwhile, Snaga skirmishers rotating around. And still, it really is just a case of reorganisation. Of course, their Blackguards moving forward again, but what are they going to do? Those infantry are surely just going to attack outwards again. They're being allowed to get a few volleys off. Will they get another one? They will, but they will pay the price for that because they will get involved in a melee fight, so they're going to have to retreat. I mean, they are going to take this more conservative approach, I suppose. At least Umbar are. Isengard with not as much room to manoeuvre, sending in a unit of Half-Orc Spearguard, but Half-Orc Spearguard don't really stand much of a chance against Hiri Out. And this is honestly where maybe sending forward units of higher quality is kind of necessary. Maybe a unit of Nazkai, I saw them loitering around. Umbar probably have their higher end units still available to them as well, but Half-Orc Spearguard, I mean, they're decent, as we saw earlier on, at being a bit of a melee blocker unit with their defensive stats, but their offensive stats, especially when you factor in the Spear Malice, is not going to be enough against a unit of Elven line infantry like the Hiri Out. They're just not going to be able to deliver the kind of damage that they may want. It is what it is. Alright, Umbar going to move forward again. Another unit of Alcarondas Legion in the vanguard, perhaps. That unit of Hiriek a little bit more depleted after their dance with the Corsair Blackguards. Shield Bearers and Axe Guard waiting. Again, the Shield Bearers are waiting, but they're not going to be as effective against Mirkwood. They'll be a little bit better against Numenor, as we mentioned, but they may not have a choice here. Umbar may just have to get some units into the mix. Harbinger's very far away. I mean, Umbar's army is not all that large after the beating they took, is it? Isengard, very much the army that has got the most. I mean, there's a few Umbar units over here as well, but it's the very basic Corsair infantry. Wavering now, the Half-Orc Spearguard being given a task which is far beyond them, so that's not too shocking to see. Back over here, Hiri Lang moving backwards. back into the organised positions they were before, but again trying to counter-attack to prevent the Corsair Blackguards from using their jabbies. Forward come the Alcarondas Legion. The Elven front line still stands strong, however, and it would take pretty much all Umbar has, I think, to start putting the Elven lines completely under the cosh. And let's not forget that there are still a few units back here, including the mighty Palace Guard. Most of those units back there in reserve are the upper crust of the Elven units. They also still have the Numenorian Royal Legion awaiting their orders. The only truly high-tier unit that the defenders have lost so far were the Pharazim Swordmasters in the struggle for the lower fortress. Greenwood Rangers once again firing. The choice to bring two of them, of course, is expensive, but considering what Rangers are, considering the high likelihood of the attackers needing to blob up in Helm's Deep Fortress, as Umbar have already found out, it is a cost that's worth running into the red limit for, which is, again, part of the reason why Rangers are hopefully going to substantially change when the next patch does drop, because as much as they do make the defenders' lives perhaps necessarily easier, I think a retooling of the meta of the game to help the defenders in other ways is kind of necessary, because as it stands, Rangers excuse me, are simply too much of a mainstay. And of course it can be true for the attackers as well. If the attackers can get a unit of Rangers into an appropriate position, it's pretty much game, set and match in their favour. So, well, Reforged Spearguard trying to move in, but there's far too many Numenorian pikes, far too many Elven infantrymen to allow them to do so. The elves also counter-pushing, really. A little bit of support from those Rangers have allowed the elves to push forward once again. Again, the Hiriak forcing the Corsair Blackguards to show them their backs. And Umbar once again in retreat. Hasn't really gone all that well for them so far, has it? A little bit of friendly fire, though, as well, is going to be forthcoming from those Greenwood Rangers, so that's worth bearing in mind as well. They do need to be a little bit careful from that perspective. Corsair Blackguards moving forwards. Balaketh Shield Bearers. An Axe Guard waiting, so a bit of attacking artillery. Trying to go after the Greenwood Rangers. Like we saw earlier on, maybe the outer ring of Helm's Deep could come to their aid here and end up killing a lot of the Greenwood Rangers in a rather buggy fashion, but as long as they die, I'm sure the attackers won't mind one bit. Getting into a position where they can surround once again. This will, of course, be an opportunity for Isengard to claim a bit of territory and rush into the outer ring of the inner fortress. More artillery being utilised. Of course, our Blackguards retreating once again. Yeah, I think they do need to take advantage of the little bit of extra room they've been given. I mean, Helm's Deep is such a constricting fortress that when you get given this kind of space as the attackers, you do kind of need to use it. So Isengard need to get in here. I mean, it is maybe a little bit of a red herring when you consider that the Greenwood Rangers are up there, but Isengard actually are going to be able to get up onto the walls here and engage the Greenwood Rangers directly. And also, it's not as if the attackers have much of a choice. Forward movement is going to be necessary, and I don't know. The defensive positions the defenders still hold and the resources they still have make me believe that the losses that the attackers took early on, Mordor specifically, are going to be something which is so difficult to recover from. It's led to this being a kind of difficult battle to commentate on in the midsection, to be honest with you, because it's been the defenders trying to get into a position where they can attack without being savaged immediately. But as a result, it's been a very slow-paced fight, and the fights that have been going on have been a little bit more like this, where it's a bit of mob mentality from the attackers. They move forward, but very, very quickly they find themselves under such pressure that they end up routing. And again, those Greenwood Rangers are going to be very effective. I mean, the Isengard Uruk-hai infantry are going to be pretty good at dealing with the damage in comparison to the others with their armour and shields, but that's not really important. Like, the Rangers' base damage is not the attraction, it's the fact that they can blanket the enemy lines with damage very, very quickly. Umbar may be moving forward now with their Balaketh units as well, maybe more out of necessity than desire, but they need to do so. They need to get units up on the walls here to intercept these Greenwood Rangers, which I think is what Umbar are doing with their Balakith Axe Guard. They need to do it because they've been far too slow at trying to intercept these Greenwood Rangers, and the Uruk-hai were on the walls, and they elected to get down off the walls again before they got into the Greenwood Rangers, which is a very confusing decision to make. And it's just yet another one which may push the attackers further along the road of destruction. But we shall have to wait and see. Now our Royal Guard moving over. I mean, they're already depleted, of course, as a result of one of the things which has gone well for the attackers. That surgical artillery strike. A little further back. Corsair fencers moving forwards. That's a unit which is actually fairly impressive. Their projectiles will be somewhat required, and then their services in melee will certainly not go amiss. They finally have managed to get a unit into these Greenwood Rangers, and the Balakith shield bearers doing the business. The Greenwood Rangers getting bisected a little bit. I mean, the Greenwood Rangers' melee defense is such that actually the Balakith shield bearers, if they are under ranger fire, they may not be able to finish off the Greenwood Rangers quickly enough. And that would be the latest in a long string of disasters that the attackers have had to withstand. Just throwing projectiles, doing good damage to the elven units. Further back, defeat seems certain. Only a military genius could win this battle. Left. Do these crossbows still have ammunition? I mean, we've seen on Helm's Deep in the past, when the rings of the fortress have been conquered, attacking crossbows can be absolutely devastating. The problem for Isengard is they may not have anything else left to contest with. I mean, he's done the right thing here, Hixcrew, though. He's got pikemen in reserve for the late game. They can be very impressive, but only when they are able to act with impunity, and that's not going to be the case here, because Numenor still very much have their pikes in action. The Nazkai as well, I mean, very impressive unit, but I don't know. Corsair fencers, they are actually starting to pressurise a little bit more now, so this could be the key moment of the fight, really. This is where we shall either see ultimate defeat for the attackers, or they will start to turn the tide. Another Isengard bodyguard unit coming forward as well. Guards will think more defensive in nature, but it will keep this attack going for longer. And the Umbar troops are starting to gain a bit of a foothold, which can only be a good thing for the spectacle of the battle. Elsewhere, guards of Orthanc up on the walls. Balakith's shield bearers. I mean, here we can see the Royal Legion of Armanelos have come over to bail out the Greenwood Rangers. This will, of course, mean the defeat of the shield bearers that are fighting on the walls. Not too surprising, though, is it? Greenwood Rangers will also escape, so they may yet, from the attacking perspective, rear their ugly heads later on, going after the Numenor Sentinels, which is a good idea, because if you can defuse the Sentinels, they still have Balagai pikemen, but your Uruk-hai pike is going to be superior, and gaining pike supremacy is going to be one way that you can put the defenders under yet more pressure. Uruk-hai infantry trying to force their way through the formation, but the Numenor Sentinels having none of it so far. Uruk-hai infantry have managed to weather the ever increasing battering that their morale seems to be taking, but these Balagai pikes do need a little bit of support actually. I think the defenders maybe take their eye off the ball just a little bit. This pike formation is being wrapped around a little bit, and in close quarters the Balagai pikes will be butchered by Uruk-hai infantry, so maybe a bit of a rethink is needed from that perspective. Warns man on Lank. Still have a unit of seafarers. Still have the Ents, which is an interesting thing. I mean, the Ents actually make for a pretty good countermeasure to the Uruk-hai pikemen, don't they? That sort of damage. Half-orc spear guard pushing in just to try and keep this attack going. I think this is more of a... They just want to keep this attack going for a little bit longer while they try and force their way through over here. And they are going to be successful over here. I mean, the addition of those Orthanc spears is such that the remaining Elven defenders won't really have the damage to batter their way through the combined forces of Isengard and Umbar over here now. So the attackers are managing to get themselves back into a good position here to contest this fight, which is good to see. I was worried about in the early to mid-game section where the defenders were very, very dominant, but this is a little bit more like it. They picked their moment, and they picked it well. Considering the Rangers have been such a thorn in their side, this will be a good bit of catharsis as the Guards of Orthanc skewer them one by one. Of course, their fencers are also over here with their twin rapiers. Royal Legion of Armenelos, though, are making quick work, really, of the Balakith shield bearers. Royal Legion of Armenelos, one of the better units of sword and shield infantry that the game has to offer, most certainly. Could be another interesting little... we'll see, because the video before this one was the brackets between the Lance Cavalry. We'll see if people like that enough for that to be a series which continues into perpetuity. Because the Royal Legion of Armenelos may have the opportunity to try and stamp their authority as the sword and shield infantry unit from that point of view. I think they would struggle against offerings like the Mithril Guard of Khazad-dûm though, but we shall see. Guards of Orthanc at the centre of this push, and the elves continuing to get forced backwards. And the problem they have here now is, if Isengard do move in numbers, there'll be no retreat for the Nari Sentinels, and that would be a big catch, really. Up here, the Corsair Fencers in a good position as well to throw their projectiles. Will they be going after the Balagai pikes, I wonder? Not for the time being, but they will hold their ground. More javelin fire through the gap. And they are going after the Uruk-hai pikemen, trying to whittle down Isengard's strength with that particular weapon. A bit further back. Of course, pikes in a siege, from an offensive perspective in old Medieval 2, were always a little bit finicky because of the secondary weapon mechanic. Pikes, of course, in Reforged, as we have always known them, will only use their pike, which means even when they get engaged in close quarters, they will persist with the pike and push the enemy back, which is what you want to happen mechanically. In an old Medieval 2, of course, they had basically a dagger or a short sword as a secondary weapon, and they would switch to it in this sort of situation, and they would be absolutely useless with it compared to the units that you would inevitably be facing. Admittedly, it's maybe a little bit more realistic that a pike would switch to a secondary weapon when you're in close quarters like this, given the fact that you would otherwise just be butchered in real life for using a pike, but still. I like that Isengard, they're continuing to push forward. The momentum is still with them here as the Guards of Orthanc push ever further forwards. Hiri Lang and Greenwood Rangers continuing to be put under a lot of pressure. A little further back we have the Naru and Naaru Sentinels. Victory is almost a certainty for the Isengard Uruk-hai infantry, so slowly but surely it's taken them a little while to get to this point, but they are managing to finish off this unit of Balagai pikemen, which was tasked with guarding the road. More Isengard reinforcements are probably forthcoming, and yeah, the Nari Sentinels at this point are kind of trapped between a rock and a hard place. They've got Uruk-hai behind them, Guards of Orthanc here. They're not going to be able to get into the kind of formation which would allow them to be super effective. Further down here, Hiri Lang, defeat seems certain. Of course, their fences still waiting in reserve. I mean, with the Harbingers of Castamere up on the walls, this is a far closer fight, but the Harbingers of Castamere are, unfortunately for them, attracting the attention of the remaining javelins that the defenders have left, and that is going to be a good use of their time, naturally. And with that kind of damage, the Royal Legion will continue to be dominant on that wall, and that will be a big loss for Umbar as well. That's a good pick from Johannes. Nothing outside the walls anymore, so the only things in reserve really are the Isengard units, which are still in formation down in the lower fortress. They will probably end up moving forward pretty quickly though. Numbers wise, the attackers have sort of claimed the initiative now. Uruk-hai infantry continuing. I mean, the Balaguer pikemen are actually in formation, so that's why they're still lasting a decent amount of time in the face of a unit which in close quarters is going to be far their superior. They're going to try and retreat. I mean, I think they would probably end up routing if they did. We still have the very best of what the elves have left to offer in every respect, really. I mean, this could end up being a bit of a mistake, because based on what Winged Swordsman has left, he's been rather stingy with his bodyguard units, and we've seen that be the downfall of many an army in the past. And I do worry that that's what he's doing. He's basically sequestered his bodyguard units away for the late game greedily, and he may not be able to withstand the numbers, especially not if they can't deal with the pikes. This could end up being a little bit messy. I mean, it is very much going to be a case of quality or quantity here in the late game. It's not overwhelming for the attackers though, so maybe Mirkwood have made the right call. We shall have to wait and see. There's also the Royal Legion, who are still very, very healthy as well, which will be contributing to the defenders here in the late game. Not quite in the final 10k frames yet, but with a concentrated assault on the inner fortress here, that is really where the final phase of this battle will begin. It looks as though they're not going to waste any time here. The Balaguer pikemen routing, but 26 of them should return actually, and still be a factor in this battle. We never know, that could be the margin by which this battle is ultimately decided. Okay, crossbowmen going to get up onto the inner walls. Have the crossbows, but I don't think the crossbows, I mean, they could try and shoot through there, but it's not going to be the easiest needle to thread, and the whole unit isn't going to be able to do it either unless you engage in some very creative positioning. Either way, the attack is underway right from the off. Elves of the Elven King, an upgraded Palace Guard, the strongest melee combatants that Mirkwood have. The pikes are going to be in here right from the start to try and force them to remain at arm's length. And the Ents, rightly, are going to be committed right from the off as well. Are the crossbows going to be able to... I think the crossbows are going after the Royal Legion actually, which is not the worst idea, seeing as they are more exposed. Seafarers could also be a better shot to make. It's not quite the Hollywood target that the Mirkwood infantry down here is, but I think you just need to be efficient at this point, and there will come a moment where the defenders simply don't have the numbers to withstand you, so if you can get some good kills, that will be all that matters. I mean, the Balakith Axe Guard will be a bit of a concern for the Ents, but the Ents are also going to start ripping their way through the Uruk-hai pikes and Uruk-hai infantry actually here. As you can see very, very quickly, Mirkwood forcing the Isengard forces back outside. The Umbar general falls. Not all of the Umbar units are locked morale. The Balakith aren't, and they are now shaken as a result of their loss of the loss of their general. And Balakith units are the lion's share, really, and Corsair fencers are what make up the remaining Umbar army. Yeah, I mean, they're doing a fair amount of damage now to the Royal Legion of Armemelos, but Numenor have already got some pretty good mileage out of them. Guards of Orthanc are also here to prevent any sort of advance on the crossbows as they get into place. Going to be a close one this though. Elven King's Palace Guard move in. We are more or less in the final 10k frames now, with the final phase of the battle already underway. So what's your money on? Quality or quantity? It's going to come down to positioning here largely, and also I think the crossbows are such an important unit. If they can be used to their fullest, it's going to be very difficult for the defenders. With stuff like Narskai and Guards of Orthanc still able to prop up their quality somewhat, that will be very significant. The pikes, of course, as well, for Isengard, who are currently still undertaking a beating from the Ents, and also, I mean, units like the Balakith Axe Guard, who are going to be pretty good against the Ents, are also shaken as a result of Umbar's lost general. Is that going to prove to be extremely significant as the battle goes along? We shall have to see. Still, of course, have fencers lurking around as well. Royal Legion of Armemelos are now going to retreat with the final defeat of the Harbingers, and I mean the Guards of Orthanc getting down from wall at this point, so the crossbows were actually open for a bit of a counter-attack, but the risk was too much, I think. The Ents retreating, their work done, not wanting to get involved too much with the units which are a hard counter to them, so allowing the attackers once again to come in and engage with the Elven infantry a little bit more exclusively. Wardens of Amon-Lank are also going to shoot at point-blank range. There's nothing really special about their projectiles other than reasonably high base damage, but they should be pretty effective. Actually, no, they do have poison projectiles, don't they? I don't know what I'm talking about. But yes, it will be pretty good at dealing with a unit like the Corsair Fencers. Slider skirmishers are around. They surely don't have any ammunition, considering how liberally they were used in the early game. Forward come the Ants once again, pushing forward. Where did the Nazkai go? There they are. They haven't seen any combat yet, unlike the Guards of Orthanc Spears, who are over here. A little bloodied, but still pretty healthy in the grand scheme of things. I mean, the Royal Legion of Almanelos having to retreat. Obviously they were taking a lot of damage, but they're also going to have to be the custodians of this other route into the fortress. So it's going to be a close affair, this, regardless of how this plays out. Elders of the Elven King, victory seems certain. So far, the calibre of units that this very elite Elven fighting force has had to face down in melee hasn't been enough to really give them too much trouble.
Our men no longer command the castle.
Is that a fact? Guards of Orthanc moving across, I mean, their numbers will far outstrip the Royal Legion of Almanelos at this point. Point blank arrow fire, but the Guards of Orthanc won't mind that. In fact, the Guards of Orthanc probably prefer the arrow fire over the two-handed axes that Wardens of Amon-Lank actually wield, in conjunction with what remains of the Royal Legion. This might be enough to actually finish the Guards of Orthanc off, who have actually been probably one of the better singular performers in the whole attacking army. That's going to be a bit of a problem though, as the Corsair Fencers continue to do their thing. The Ents now turning around. Only 2 of them remain, but their presence in terms of dealing a little bit of quick damage may be worth it over on this side of things now. Trusting in the... actually, there's a couple of the Ents still over here, so they're actually dividing their attention, amazingly enough. But they can trust, I think, in the quality of the Elven infantry over here to do the business a little bit more so. But the pikes are still here, which is a concern. There's not as many of them, though. Nazkai moving forwards. It is over here, though, where more of the Ents arriving now. Some crossbows going to try and move forward. I mean, they can try and get up onto the walls, but if they do so, they will immediately be engaged, I'm sure, by the unit Seafarers, which is still in reserve. Well, well, well. Back over here. A bit of a gap appearing between the Mirkwood and Isengard combatants, which is a little bit bizarre. The Ents right in and amongst things here. I mean, the Corsair Fencers should do a decent amount of damage to them, but stuff like Uruk-hai crossbows is of course going to get absolutely railed by a unit like Ents. Entirely sure how that's going to go. I mean, there's not really any reinforcements left over here as well, so this attack over here is not going to get any further reinforcements. Wardens of Amon-Lank struggling a little bit, perhaps. Seafarers of Nindamos. What's going on over here? Nazkai able to push their way in? Is there a way up here? I forget sometimes the routes that you can take, the esoteric routes that you can take up onto the walls, and clearly the defenders have left one open. The Nazkai, though, taking damage here from the Wardens of Amon-Lank, also going to start shooting into them. This is going to be a concern. They got a couple of volleys off, but that's not going to be enough, surely, for Seafarers to win, especially not with a bit of crossbow support, so that's going to be worrying moments here for the defenders. However, the committal of units like this to engagements which basically aren't the one directly on the front line speak well of the Elven chances of winning the frontal engagement with their elite units. I mean, the Isengard force is going to be dependent on its pikes to hold the elves in place for a longer period of time so they can win elsewhere. You know, the ones of Amon Lank here need to start shooting the Nazkai like this, really. Those 2 hit points will be shaved away fairly quickly, you would suggest. They continue to do their thing. Seafarers, victory is a distinct possibility. Uruk-hai crossbows, they still have ammunition. If they do, they should be trying to use it at the very least, because they're not going to get ideal shots, but something may be good enough. Snaga skirmishers moving forward, the final sort of roll of the dice for this frontal attack, just to try and keep it going for as long as possible. But of course Snaga are going to get ripped limb from limb by the kind of elven defenders that await them inside. Seafarers of Nindamos, I mean, there are a fair few of them for the Nazkai to try and crush their way through. But they should be able to manage that much. They are taking those hits from the ones of Amon Lank on the low ground. There's not really much else to say about this fight at this point. It's just a case of what breaks first. Numenor in general finally falls. A combination of crossbows and fencers able to finally bring him down, but the Numenorians aren't really going to be routing well. The announcer seems fairly confident in their abilities to win this. Percentage of allies killed, though, is still 1% greater than the amount of attackers that have been killed. But perhaps the quality here, I mean, a lot of those percentages, after all, are made up of units like Snaga skirmishers. There goes Thranduil, though. Quick-fire deaths for the defending generals. Some routing from crossbows being used as cannon fodder. The Nazkai defeat is a distinct possibility. Can they actually win this fight down here, though? It looks like the Corsair Fencers are going to be able to overcome the Warns of Amon Lank, which is a problem, because those Warns of Amon Lank were kind of necessary for supporting the Seafarers, who are slowly but surely going to get absolutely demolished by Nazkai. Slowly may be the operative word, though. Can the sheer quality of the Elven units on this front line over here win out, or will the pikes delay them enough for Isengard to win the battle in other ways? Because it is primarily Mirkwood versus Isengard at this point. Numenor going to be a spent force very soon. Umbar probably going to follow in their footsteps. His crossbows still doing their best. Most interesting. Is that Umbar? I think it must be, because their fences are gone. Ones of Amon Lank still alive, but not in the kind of numbers that will give a unit like Nazkai any sort of pause in melee whatsoever. Those crossbows now out of ammunition will have to go to the front line. 60 Elders of the Elven King, I think, actually, looking at this with Palace Guard, I think it's going to be too much for Isengard to actually overcome. If they don't have any crossbow ammunition left, I don't think they're actually going to be able to defeat the Elven quality. I don't think they're going to have enough. And, I mean, the Nazkai may very well end up winning up here. They'll take a bit more in terms of damage and losses before they do so, but they need to make their way through the Seafarers quickly and maybe get a rear charge. Maybe that will be the option. With Pike still alive, they could try and win this battle in that way. I'm not sure. We'll go up to ×2 speed though, because this fight has been pretty grindy throughout, but certainly here in the late game as the pikes slowly but surely, especially with these catapults around, making life even slower for the Elven defenders. I mean, the Elders of the Elven King have taken virtually no damage by the looks of things, which goes to show the calibre of units that have been sent their way, I suppose, not being up to the task whatsoever. Further in, Nazkai still doing their thing. 25 of them, so they have taken losses. The Seafarers wielding those axes, showing that they can dish out a little bit of damage. It's not going to be enough to win, but it's going to be enough to... One player admits defeat. Who is that? Is that Umbar? Probably Umbar. Seeing as Isengard, Numenor and Mirkwood still fight. Yeah, not really much else to say about this battle at this point. Other than just waiting, really, to see if the elves' dominance in this respect can continue. And, I mean, it's dead even now, 96% to 96%. Attack is actually taking the lead once again, which is interesting. The Uruk-hai crossbows taking that damage. The Nazkai, 25 of them remain. Maybe 24 or 23 by the time they tear their way through what remains of the Seafarers and these few Wardens. The Wardens may be a little bit more capable of dealing damage with those axes, although, yeah, a couple of Nazkai falling. So this dark, dingy section of the fortress where the final battle will take place, unfortunately. Further back down. Yeah, the Uruk-hai crossbowmen. Doesn't look like there's many pikes left alive either, which really is another sign of the death knell of the attackers' intents in this fight. That's 23 of them. What are they doing? Why are they going that way? Should be going this way, getting down here and then recharging, not attacking right into the front of them. I don't think it would matter in the long run anyway, but it'd be interesting to see where they emerge from. Is it here? Yes, it is. So there is actually a way up there, even though there is no door. This is false advertisement at its finest, I think you'll find, as we enter the final 1,000 frames. Palace Guard still going to have too much in the way of skill and numbers alongside the Elves of the Elven King for even reinforcing Nazkai to turn this battle around, and I think that, yeah, finally the defenders take the lead in terms of percentage points, and there's going to be no recovering that for the attackers. But it is what it is. A defending victory on Helm's Deep is actually maybe somewhat rarer than you would expect. Yes, and that will surely be the end of Isengard now. The Nazkai will stick around and fight, but the out-of-ammo crossbows almost certainly will not. I say that, they actually are. Goes to show what I know. Isengard made of stern stuff. Uruk-hai a little bit better than ill-disciplined orc rabble, but the defenders win, and it's really only Palace Guard and Elves of the Elven King that do remain. And there you go, the disjointed nature of the attack in the end, paving the way for a defending victory. I think if the attackers had been maybe a little bit more on the same page as one another, it wouldn't have taken much given the margin of victory that the defenders had, then this fight could very well have gone the other way. But as it is, the defenders, and they did several things really, really well as well. Like the lower fortress fight was maybe a little bit too open for the defenders' liking, but and again, maybe a little bit too liberal early on with the Elven Arrow fire, but for the most part, when it really counted, they were able to utilise their muscle and their ranged support to, you know, the appropriate degree. And in the end, I do think that the correct outcome was reached. The defenders scoring a victory. Elves of the Elven King getting a lot of kills. Most of those actually probably coming in melee, to be honest with you. Early on, able to do some good damage to the Nazgul and a few other things with their bows, but late on, ripping their way through. Admittedly, stuff like Uruk-hai crossbows and Snaga skirmishers, but still, you can't complain about 507 kills. Both units of Greenwood Rangers doing exactly what you need them to, given the current meta of the game. So Mirkwood doing exactly the right thing by bringing them. Hiri Lang not breaking 100 kills, but most of the other Elven units here were. This initial front line, maybe this was the one facing Umbar, because this was really just a blocking manoeuvre for the Greenwood Rangers to do their thing. And when Umbar did eventually break through, they did so fairly comprehensively, so there is that as well. Of course, we can't see Numenor's kills, but the elves with their ranged focus were always going to be maybe the ones getting higher kills in comparison to the more upfront and personal Numenor. Up close and personal Numenor, I should say. So yeah, big thank you to Winged Swordsman for sending me this battle replay. Had to go and get the older version of Helm's Deep to actually showcase this one. And this may end up being the last time we see the old version of Helm's Deep if I have my way. So yeah, we'll wait and see on that one, but this could be a goodbye to this particular map as the updated version maybe becomes the mainstay. Big thank you to all the players as well for being a part of this battle replay, a very close one, if a very slow burn. But yeah, as for what's coming up soon, maybe a few more of those bracket style videos like I did with the cavalry. It depends really on what the response was to the video before this one. I think I'll probably end up recording another one before that comes out anyway, so you'll probably end up seeing another one of those regardless, maybe between heavy archers, sort of non-specialty archers as it were. So that'll be an interesting thing to see. Also, as far as replays goes, I actually have another one on Silmarillion, which will be very interesting because it sees the introduction of the Naugrim, or the dwarves, finally. They've been sort of much touted for a long time, and now they're finally here. So in terms of battle replays, that will probably be the very next one that you see. It will be a Silmarillion one. As far as the very next video goes, though, that will be a channel update. That will be the long talked about channel update at this point that I've been constantly talking about. And yeah, that will be forthcoming, and then a couple of weeks down the line into May, we'll be looking at doing a live stream follow up to that, because there are a few things that are going to be happening throughout this year. The exact details of which I'm not certain of, but they will impact the channel, maybe in a positive way, maybe not. It really does remain to be seen, but I do think that it does need to be said. And also there's a few things which actually are not related to me personally, which may also affect the channel as well. It's sort of more of a mod related thing, more so than myself, but that's something else which we'll talk about in the channel update, which will be forthcoming the following video from this one. And then we'll be looking at Silmarillion Battle Replay, possibly another Reforged one after that, and then maybe another one of the bracket style videos that we've done. So that's sort of a loose idea of what's going to be coming up in the next couple of weeks following on from this particular video. So yeah, big thank you to Winged Swordsman once again for sending me the replay. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.